Hi, my name is Saunders. I'm here to talk about self-reported metrics, specifically with a case study involving a comparison between the user-reported usage of cell phones versus server log data presented by the telecommunications company that the users were on. So what are self-reported metrics? Well, first, they are a quantifiable means to develop, iterate, and improve on a product based on the end user feedback specifically. There are there can be a correlation between the user interface and the user's interaction with the device um, by having a device that it could be more complicated. There could be more frustrated end users. Something that's simple could mean a easier interface and easier time with users, therefore encouraging further use. And unlike other metrics, this, as it was per examples, can focus on the subjective data that each individual experiences. But this then can be collected in aggregate to allow a clearly defined areas of improvement, areas of exception, and areas of good performance. Each individual will actually determine the significance of those metrics that are collected. So this can actually help emphasize different perspectives in use so that you get something different besides just the developers or just a small focus group, but instead you can get a wide variety of selected opinions on the product itself. The two primary methods of data collection for self-reported metrics necessitate relying on user-provided answers, which happen to be survey collection and interviews. Interviews generally face-to-face or over the phone with questions asked by the interviewer to the interviewee. Survey collection is generally the less direct method, a more passive method on the researcher's part, and more active on the um, user's part, and allows a greater abstraction between the user and the researcher, but does actually encourage a more truthful environment sometimes based on less tension that can be inherent within direct contact between two different parties. For this case study, a telecommunications company was seeking to determine the validity and the reliability of user-provided data. They were hoping to see if the information that had been collected previously was useful and could continue to be useful for future projects, product development, things like that. The researchers for this particular case study investigated older studies at first to identify survey question trends. They wanted to see how questions were presented previously and then what are the main focus of those questions. They determined that the two areas that all questions could be categorized into was the frequency of use and the duration of use. Frequency being how often a user would send a text or how often they would send a call or receive either of those, while duration was how long in a session, how long a phone call lasts, how long they were in a text message conversation, things like that. The researchers were not able to get the specific wording on questions for a lot of these older studies. Generally, the questions were presented in a generalized format. So the goal instead was to find a means to acquire more reliable user data to help bolster the company's future product development. If they were able to see through their own application of those two survey points, they could figure out a more reliable means to get data from end users. The researchers helped develop two rounds of survey questions. At first, they had initially received 1,499 respondents for both rounds, which was about a 65% response rate for two rounds. But then they noticed between the two that there could be participants that were providing unreliable data. So they did take some actions in order to filter out those potential data points. Things like comparing the radically different age between the first and the second round as reported by the user help to eliminate those that may have just blazed through the questions or had somebody else do the work or things like that. That way they could try to get the most honest answers from the participants. They ended up with about 426 of the second round respondents who not only passed both rounds and provided what they could determine was reliable data, but also consented to having their cell phone log data accessed by the researchers for actual data comparison. The survey questions themselves, they focus on the duration and frequency of use. The duration was reported through the usage of the word yesterday. They basically asked for how long did you have calls yesterday? How long were you text messaging yesterday? That way it was less a specific date for the users, but more a recollection of what they had done in a full day. The frequency of use was reported as the number of calls to text in a specific time frame. Usually these were how many calls do you expect in a week? And so people could answer 11 plus a day or 1 to 2 times a week. They were given multiple values as well as multiple time spans to answer to. That way the researchers could help narrow the data to each individual's specific use. For all the data, both sent and received calls as well as sent and received texts were recorded, but that data itself was split. So calls were one focus and then SMS texts were another. Here is a table of the frequency of use for the yesterday section, split up between voice and SMS text. As you can see, the self-reported data for the mean, median, and standard deviation for both the voice and the SMS tend to have values that were higher than what the actual logs were recording, with a bigger significant difference in the SMS than with the voice. This tends to mean that people over-report what they think their actual cell phone usage is. And this is something that does seem to occur throughout the study that the researchers have found. Here's a table for how often users use a cell phone in a certain amount of time. They can either have 11 plus a day, sometimes 3 to 6 times a week. And again, the data outside of at least once a day column or the less often column, most people tend to over-report the amount of time that they are actually on their cell phone, which in today's time may be funny because people tend to think that everyone's on their cell phone all the time. Now, this may be skewed because the data itself is just for actual usage in terms of voice and texting and not browsing the internet or other functions that a cell phone can do. But bear in mind that this study itself took place in 2013, which predates a lot of major cell phone development as an actual personal computing device compared to just something to telecommunications device. Once the researchers had received their data for frequency and duration of use, they wanted to use the demographics data provided by the telecommunications company to help determine whether or not a person's demography influenced the usage itself. First, they used the control of whether or not the person pays the cost of their cell phone themselves versus people that are on somebody else's plan as a means to help reduce the likelihood that there would be an inherent bias towards underreporting if you are using somebody else's money to pay for your plan. They found that males tend to overreport their usage a lot. Age seemed to have not much of a difference when you were older. However, younger kids tend to underreport their usage. But the main takeaway that the researchers found is that there isn't much beyond correlation with this data. They could not find a clear demography that results in over or underreporting. Across the board, for the most part, humans tend to have the same patterns with their actual cell phone use, and college degree, married, house size, age didn't really have a dramatic impact on any of the data that was collected. So, in conclusion, for self-reported metrics, data acquired can be affected by the end user perceptions. With the actual data, there was no clear demographic trends towards over and underreporting outside of if you are a human, you're likely to overreport the data you have. Self-reported metrics can be useful for actual product usability, but the study here shows that developers need to proceed cautiously in the actual data acquisition because the data itself cannot be as accurate as a computer can provide. There needs to be steps taken to help reduce or mitigate those inflated or underinflated numbers that humans can provide. The researchers did provide suggested possible means to help improve data acquisition. The couple first responses were to have the users actually record their usage in a diary, or to have the respondents report cell phone data from the devices themselves, look back and see how long a call was, look back and see how many texts you sent in a day. But both of these, the researchers did point out, put a burden on the participant and could lead to possible frustration, possible quitting of the project itself, because you're putting more of the burden of data collection on the participants as opposed to the researchers themselves. However, if you are able to get users to do that, you can have much more reliable data. An interesting point that the researchers found while studying the older cases was that if you provide a broader range of possible survey answers, if you aren't letting the users have an open-ended question, instead must pick from a list, if you have more options to a point before you reach an area where too many options can overwhelm the participants, you can generally get more accurate data from people as they are able to determine the point of the question. This was an interesting idea that I thought the researchers brought, that because people aren't just given questions and answers, but they also tend to are curious to the investigating the actual reasoning behind data collection, that you are able to help reduce that bias by providing more options for someone to select from. They're able to be more they're able to self-report more accurately over the course of the project. So thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation, and have a good day.